Since January 1st, our country has seen a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic and the largest mass protests in decades. Americans have sought leadership during these trying times, both as someone to guide them as we navigate the uncharted waters of coronavirus, and as someone to lodge complaints with as they protest racial inequities in their streets. Justin Elicker, in his first 200 days of Mayor of New Haven, has had to rise to these times. He is here today to talk with us about what is happening in his city and his approach to leadership in 2020. We'd like to thank our new premier sponsor at Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com, as well as our sponsors at Gateway and Housatonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice is a Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments below. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or our member municipal leaders. Mayor, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
You were inaugurated on January 1st, 2020, and less than 100 days in, you have to make the decision to close down the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New Haven due to the coronavirus. Those who know New Haven know how seriously the parade is taken in town. How did you go about making that first kind of critical decision about coronavirus, and what guidance did you have in making that decision?
I remember very, very early on, cases started to happen in China, and we started to internally in City Hall talk about what are we going to do to respond once we get a case. I remember an email I specifically sent saying it's likely we're going to get a case at some point, and think about now the world we're in. So we've been talking about this for quite some time, but the call about St. Patrick's Day happened quite quickly. I remember there was a fundraiser for the St. Patrick's Day Parade that was maybe a few days before we made the call. And I actually showed up at the fundraiser, and there were hundreds of people at Anthony's Ocean View, all together, even though there was a lot of already information out there that people shouldn't be hugging and shaking hands and everything.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, imagine this times thousands.
Yeah.
This is going to be a bad situation. And even though St. Patrick's Day Parade is such an important event in New Haven, it's important for us to make this call to keep people safe. We had conversations with the health director and other folks, and decided to make the call.
Since that time, New Haven has had some ups and some downs in the response. We didn't have as much information back then as we do now, and the per capita rate is still relatively high around here. What do you know now that you wish you had known at the beginning of all this?
I think there's a lot of things that we all wish we would have known. An example is mask wearing. So early on, nobody was wearing masks. And turns out now we know that masks.
Yeah, it was all just like wash your hands, don't touch your face was like the first kind of real.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Wash your hands for 20 seconds. I can't tell you how many times I told people that. Don't shake other people's hands, don't touch your face.
Yeah.
And it was very, we were deep into this thing before we started wearing masks. And I remember the first time I put a mask in front of the press, it was almost surprising.
Yeah.
Now it's just standard, right? The way that we've approached nursing homes, I think that we would have done things much differently in the beginning. This is more of a, nursing homes are regulated at the state level, but the city's been involved in trying to support our nursing homes. And now we regularly test everyone in nursing homes to identify cases immediately, and then cohort people into different groups depending on if they're COVID positive, suspected, or COVID negative. And that strategy has worked amazingly well with the nursing homes in New Haven. But we had, we lost a lot of residents, I think in large part because there were just a lot of things we didn't know about how to handle this strategy.
Yeah, I know fairly early on, I noticed, I live in New Haven, I'm a resident, and I live over by Bella Vista, and it's not a retirement home, but it's a retirement community. And early on, they kind of shut that off and said, no visitors right now. And I was impressed by kind of the thought process there. Yeah,
we were very, very focused early on Bella Vista.
Yeah.
Not as much focused on nursing homes because we anticipated that nursing homes would have, because they have medical staff generally on site and have more control over the site, would have fewer problems. And we anticipated Bella Vista would have a lot of problems because it's just not controlled environment. Like people
Yeah.
come and go all the time.
Yeah.
And so we met multiple times with the management company there and helped put in place a lot of safeguards, which, we've been very grateful. Bella Vista's actually amazingly had very few cases over
Which
these
is great.
past
Yeah.
3 or 4 months. But I think that the nursing homes blindsided us a little bit.
Yeah. Some of the measures that the city has taken have been celebrated, such as the implementation of contact tracing system in conjunction with the city health department. That was before the state even had theirs up and running. How did that program work out?
I think it worked out quite well. As many folks that have been following the press know, testing and contact tracing are key to making sure that if there's another outbreak, we get it under control quickly and it doesn't spread to many people. And so we work very closely with through our health department with our partners and a lot of volunteers
Hmm.
through the Medical Reserve Corps, and also Yale University had a lot of volunteers that helped out with the contact tracing program as well. And because of that, we had the capacity to very quickly determine where people were exposed, who else might
Hmm.
be exposed, and talk directly with people about how they needed to self-isolate to ensure the safety of others. And just an example of how this was even recently successful, there was a church in Fairhaven that had
Hmm.
an outbreak just about a week ago.
Hmm.
And our health department quickly uh, called the leaders of the church, got the
Hmm.
phone numbers of people that attended the church, called them. And because of that, we believe that we caught a potentially significantly bad situation early
Yeah,
on, and got that under control.
that's great. And what was the transition to the state program like?
So, so the state, ultimately New Haven is not an island, right?
Hmm.
People work in New Haven, people shop in New Haven, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so, New Haven can't do this on our own. And a truly successful contact tracing program needs to be done at a much broader level
Hmm.
with more resources, but also connecting with many people in other towns. And so the state has been putting together a contact tracing program that is much broader,
Hmm.
and asked us to integrate our system into theirs, which they have done. I think that it's a little bit different than ours. And of course,
Yeah.
whenever you do a transition to a new program, there's some growing pains, but
Hmm.
overall, it's the right step to make sure that we're working together with our surrounding towns to get things under control.
Yeah. Speaking of starting out, have you coordinated kind of since the beginning with, the mayors in Hamden, West Haven, East Haven, surrounding towns? Has that kind of been an ongoing conversation between you guys?
So specific to contact tracing, our program, if there was someone exposed in New Haven that lived in Hamden, we would
Hmm.
we would call them.
Hmm.
The state's program incorporates everyone in the state,
Yeah.
but in general, there's been a lot of communication with
Yeah.
some surrounding towns on a lot of different issues, and also the mayors of other major cities. I have a weekly call with the mayors of Waterbury and Hartford and Norwalk and Bridgeport and a handful of other cities, just to connect and talk about what other mayors are going through, brainstorm about ideas, see if there's things that we can work on together. And I also frequently talk with mayors of some of the surrounding towns in New Haven to make sure that we're doing things together as well.
That's great. So one area of reopening that's on a lot of people's minds at this point is reopening schools. There seems to be three kind of different basic plans going around right now. A full reopen, a hybrid reopen, and staying completely online. Each has pluses and minuses. For instance, full reopen would require children to wear masks all day and all sorts of strict protocols, which could be very difficult, especially with the smaller children. What are you and the Board of Education looking at in terms of making that decision?
So a couple things. First of all, technically the governor is the one that makes the decision
Hmm.
on whether we go full reopen, hybrid,
Hmm.
or online learning. Our preference is that we have a little bit of local flexibility.
Hmm.
Our situation is different than a Cheshire or a Woodbridge.
Hmm.
And I think that that's really important to underscore. It's easier for people in suburban towns that may have more resources, for example, to drive their kids to school,
Hmm.
or to ensure that online learning works well because most people have devices and access to
Yeah.
the internet. New Haven's a different situation. A lot of people don't drive, don't because they don't have a car, and
Hmm.
so our kids have to use buses, and we're dealing with a much larger system of
Yeah.
schools, and so it's just more challenging. At this point, given the number of cases that we have, which is quite low,
Hmm.
but I also think there's the potential for them to go up.
Yeah.
Our preference is to go to the hybrid model, which
Hmm.
is uh, our plan is that half of the kids come in for 2 days a week, and
Hmm.
then the other half come in for another separate 2 days a week.
Hmm.
And then the final day is left to the teachers to do prep work,
Hmm.
because teachers will have to do online learning prep and in classroom prep,
Hmm.
because all families under all three scenarios, full day learning, hybrid, or online, have the option to opt out and do online learning. So that's a lot of pressure on teachers to do a lot more preparation work to prepare for that. But our preference is to do hybrid learning.
Hmm.
It helps us decompress the classroom, decompress the buses, keep the kids safe. Teachers and staff, understandably, some of them are concerned. We want to make sure that we're keeping everyone safe. And we're hopeful that the governor will give us that flexibility to make that decision.
Yeah, you mentioned the staff stuff. Can you go forward with any kind of plan without kind of the full buy-in of teachers and parents?
Yeah, yes. I think that it's really important. There's been a lot of fear throughout this whole process,
Yeah.
right? A lot of fear throughout this whole process. And I remember back to when we designated Career High School as a site for an isolation shelter
Hmm.
for individuals experiencing homelessness. And there was just a lot of fear because there was a lot of unknowns about COVID. And
Yeah.
as we all have had different personal experiences connecting with the virus, either people have gotten it themselves or loved ones,
Hmm.
um, we've had a better understanding of what it means. And similarly, because there's an unknown about going back to school and what that might look like, there's a lot of fear among some teachers and staff. And I think that's fair. I think that we need to do more work on the administration side and on the New Haven Public Schools side to share the work that we are doing to ensure the safety of teachers. And that's, everything from decompressing the classroom to changing the way that school lunch works, to drop off and pickup time.
Hmm.
There's a lot of details that have been incorporated into the plan that Dr. Tracy and her team have developed that are designed very specifically to keep students and staff safe.
Yeah.
One more thing to add to this: there's a risk to us not going back to school, right?
Hmm.
Um, if kids don't go back to school, the online learning, as a parent,
Yeah.
I know this is just not the same type of quality as in-person learning.
Yeah.
And that connection that a teacher and students get is very important to their development.
Hmm.
But also, school is a place where kids get food.
Yeah.
School is a place where it may be the only contact a child has with the outside world. And if they're in a dangerous situation at
Hmm.
home, it's an important place for them to have those kind of protections.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's an either or question.
Yeah.
Both of these have risks, but both of them we can, as much as possible, make them controlled and calculated risks to reduce
Yeah.
the overall risk to everyone.
Um, and another area, aside from schools and that stuff, that we kind of found interesting was in New Haven, closed off part of College Street to add more space for socially distanced outdoor dining. This idea that kind of grown around the country as this has been going on, especially in the bigger cities like New York and Denver. Is there space to look at a change like this on a more permanent kind of basis?
I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Ultimately, we'd have to work with the businesses and the Board of Alders who
Hmm.
have the authority over the street closures to make sure that it works for everyone.
Yeah.
But there's been a lot of really positive feedback about some of the street closures. Another one that we've done is closing the roads around East Rock Park.
Hmm.
And that has been wildly popular. I've gotten tons of emails and calls about how people really enjoy the option to walk in places in the park that they may not have walked in before, and people really enjoy that. And I
Yeah.
think that this is a way to help downtown businesses, not just during COVID, but hopefully after COVID, having a kind of pedestrian type of mall.
Yeah.
It sounds like a great idea, and could really promote business and make New Haven an even more lively city.
Yeah, the walkable cities thing has been kind of a growing kind of undercurrent in a lot of planning I've heard of lately across the country.
Agreed.
Um, you are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH LP 103.5 FM. So one other issue, other than coronavirus, the other issue that has come to the fore kind of this year nationally is inequities based on race, meaning predictable outcomes in housing, policing, and even representation judged by the color of your skin. New Haven has called racism a public health crisis, along with several other towns and cities. Can you tell us what that means to New Haven?
Yeah, I think COVID has exposed, in particular, a lot of issues around the inequities that many of us that have lived in New Haven for a long time have known for years, uh, and specific to the health issues associated with systemic racism and inequities. Um, People of color have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. There's many more cases. The cases are more severe. And that's an indication of a lot of the inequalities. That's an indication that people of color don't have access to appropriate health care.
Mhm.
A lot of people have a higher propensity for comorbidities, but it's also an indication that many people of color don't have the ability to telework because oftentimes people are working on the front lines
Yeah.
and don't have the option to opt out to exposing themselves to other people. And that's just one indication of a lot of the systemic challenges that exist in our cities, around our nation, around racism. We've talked a lot about police brutality and the challenges that communities of color have experienced with the relationship with the police. And there's been a lot of work done in the last several weeks on that. And my
Mhm.
administration is actually working on some things to address issues around, in particular, the relationship between the police and the community, and this struggling really with this deeply with this question about how to keep communities safe,
Yeah.
which doesn't always mean having more police or having the police involved at all. But in addition to that, I think there's a real economic question here.
Mhm.
I've come out and supported the idea of a segregation tax because Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation.
Yeah.
And because suburban communities put up barriers to access to affordable housing
Mhm.
developments, it means that so many people don't have the option to integrate into other towns.
Yeah.
And towns very proactively prevent that kind of integration. And I think that either towns can and should support increased options for affordable housing, or
Mhm.
they should pay a tax so that places like New Haven that have upwards of 30% affordable housing have the kind of economic support that we need to make sure that our residents have the resources they need
Mhm.
to get out of poverty.
Yeah. Um, so the protests have been going across the nation, some of which have gotten violent. There's been, there's Portland, all that situation. Whereas in New Haven, it's been relatively peaceful. At one point, I-95 got shut down, and it was, it was a big thing, but it was peaceful and whatever. How do you think that worked? What do you credit that to?
So I think overall, a couple of things. First of all, New Haven has a history of protests and peaceful
Hmm.
protesting. Generally a week doesn't go by in New Haven without some sort of protest, and I think
Hmm.
that's an indication of a very lively and typically very mature public dialogue.
Hmm.
And so this is something that New Haven is, I think, as a city, as a community, really experienced with. And the protests around Black Lives Matter were no different.
Yeah.
I do think that uh, I made some missteps early on
Hmm.
in looking at what was going on in some of the other larger municipalities around the
Yeah.
nation and some of the violence we saw, and thinking
Hmm.
that might happen in New Haven.
Yeah.
And so, for example, the first large scale Black Lives Matter protest, I think could have been handled better.
Hmm.
And frankly, I feel sorry to the organizers of that protest for some of the missteps that I made. For
Mhm.
example, they came to the police station to speak with me, and I should have come out much earlier. I think that would have de-escalated the situation quite
Yeah.
quickly. But overall, overwhelmingly, the protests in New Haven have been an outpouring of rage and anger
Mhm.
towards the inequities and the mistreatment of people in communities of color. But they've been done in a way that expresses that, I think, productively, and elevates the issue without taking away from the importance of it by having some distraction
Yeah.
of violence or destruction of property, those sorts of things.
Kind of related to very related to this movement. Recently, there was a big controversy in New Haven with the removal of the Christopher Columbus statue in Worcester Square. How do you approach these kind of issues from your constituents, and why is taking down a statue easier than reforming the police system?
I think they're all pretty complicated, right?
Yeah.
Just to that specific question, taking down a statue is just taking down a statue,
Yeah.
right? Reforming a police system that has been uh, put together over decades, if not
Mhm.
centuries, is much more complicated. Also, because it very much involves people's lives. But I think that the removal of the Columbus statue was also a really big deal.
Yeah.
The Columbus statue, to some people, represented hurt and colonization and
Mhm.
um, a kind of racism, in particular towards the indigenous communities
Mhm.
in this region and around what we now know as the United States.
Yeah.
And to others, it was a celebration of Italian heritage.
Yeah.
And you saw those passions come out during the protests that happened when the statue was being removed.
Yeah.
And I think that those conversations are ones that we need to have more and more of among different groups, among those within the affinity groups, but
Mhm.
also across affinity groups, because there's, given all the politics going on in the nation and the
Mhm.
divisiveness in the nation, um, I think that when we step back and actually look at what our goals are,
Mhm.
most people would agree that we should be compassionate towards our neighbors. And that's not just the people physically living next to us, but that's
Mhm.
people in other countries, that's people in other states. We should be supportive of those that don't have as many resources as we
Mhm.
do. And we should listen and try to understand people of all different cultures. I think most people would agree with that. And we have a lot more common grounds that we can work together to connect than what we often focus on, which is those issues that we don't agree upon.
Yeah.
Um, and to your question about issues around policing, there's a lot more work to do here, and it's complicated as well. Our police do a lot of good work in this city, and I think that it's unfair for people to make police the enemy. I think
Mhm.
that's just unfair, and especially in New Haven, where many police officers are working really hard. They chose New Haven
Yeah.
in large part because they care about community policing. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to do, that New Haven doesn't have history of officers doing inappropriate things, and that it doesn't that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that those officers are held accountable.
Yeah. Speaking of the officers, and New Haven does have a history, kind of as an example of community policing to other departments across the nation. Is there any avenue to reach out to New Haven citizens, particularly youth, to become police officers?
Yeah, so it's been on pause because of COVID, but we have a
Yeah.
POW program that
Hmm.
allows young people to engage in basically kind of a camp um, for police officers.
Hmm.
When we do recruitment, we work hard to do outreach to individuals that are within New Haven to make
Hmm.
sure that we have a lot of people that are knowledgeable about
Hmm.
uh, how to enter the force and how to apply for the force.
Yeah.
And I also think that while there's some concerns about it that are understandable, our school resource officer program
Hmm.
does give young people an opportunity to interact with officers when there are not issues, right?
Hmm.
Oftentimes, a lot of people in the community, their first interaction with an officer is when someone's in trouble or when there's a
Yeah.
crisis. And we should find more opportunities for people to interact with officers when things are going well,
Yeah.
to build that trust on both sides.
I know I've seen in the past, there's like get coffee with a cop programs across the country that people do, like those sort of interactions where it doesn't have to be, you only see me when something's gone terribly wrong.
Exactly.
Um, you recently made a call to strengthen New Haven's role as a sanctuary city. Why is that important to you?
I think it goes back to that compassion piece, that help your neighbor out piece.
Yeah.
Um, Congress can't get its act together
Hmm.
around a real immigration reform bill.
Yeah.
And I'm a realist, and I'm also uh, someone that tries to be compassionate.
Hmm.
Undocumented residents are living in our city,
Yeah.
and they've been living in our city for a long time. They're part of our community.
Uh-huh.
They overwhelmingly pay taxes.
Hmm.
They contribute to the community in many ways. And I
Yeah.
think that we need to be real about the fact that people are in our community, and we want people to feel safe calling the police if there's an issue, because we
Yeah.
don't want there to be abuse. We want people to cooperate with the police if there's information that needs to be shared. We want people to feel safe.
Yeah.
Um, we want people to feel safe in our schools, and that they're not going to have a teacher or someone report them to ICE.
Hmm.
And and so I think both from a practical perspective and a compassionate perspective, it's important for New Haven to take a stand and say, we care about all of our residents,
Yeah.
regardless of their document status.
Yeah. And I think in that you are continuing stuff from your predecessors, because I know when John DeStefano, now your media person, but before that, set up the New Haven ID card thing. That was a big deal because they gave the New Haven ID to people regardless of immigration status, which allowed them not only to have an identification, but then to open bank accounts and things like that, which was big news at the time because New Haven was very on the forefront of that. And it's interesting to see you kind of trying to push and continue that legacy of being at the forefront of these issues.
Yeah, exactly. I think that I think that my hope is that the federal government will, as the pressure increases, change the trajectory in their approach to immigration. That
Yeah.
is one that is more fair. I mean, the DACA question, for example, it's just ridiculous that we can't figure that out, and ensure that residents have some permanent certainty around their future.
Yeah.
But there's so many other examples of that where we're really approaching things in a backwards way that is contrary to a significant part of our history and the spirit of the creation of our country.
Yeah. And kind of a final question. What does it mean to lead a city in 2020? 200 days in, are there any lessons you've learned or wisdom you'll take with you in the next 200 days?
To be honest, I haven't had a lot of time to reflect on that question, because it seems like every day there's some new challenge that we're
Yeah.
facing. I can say that I started with a 100-day plan and a 2-year plan and a
Mhm.
long-term plan. And let's just say the 100-day plan will happen, but not
Mhm.
in 100 days. And the overall challenges that we
Mhm.
face and the overall vision on how to address them is the same.
Yeah.
I talked a lot about economic inequality in New Haven, and COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests in recent days, the drug overdoses we've seen,
Mhm.
all of these issues and the way that we've handled them and who they have impacted goes back to this issue around income inequality. And until we're able to, in a very meaningful and deep way, undo some of the systems that existed for decades and decades and decades, we're not going to be able to truly move the dial on what we talk about,
Mhm.
oftentimes through rhetoric about the American dream of everyone having opportunities.
Yeah.
People can have opportunities if they have all kinds of barriers in front of them. And to be a mayor today in the nation, I believe mayors have a real opportunity to struggle with and address that question in a meaningful way. And I think this is a defining moment for the nation, and mayors have the opportunity to really do something big.
Well, I hope this is your opportunity to do something big for New Haven.
I'll be working on it.
All right. Thanks so much for talking with us today.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you, Mayor.
All right. Take care.
Thanks to our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, which you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. Also, thanks to our sponsors, Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.